So data security, data privacy, but also the accuracy of what they're finding.
We need to really develop what the guardrails are, sort of the bright red line guardrails.
Because somebody referenced the word winter in their response, it said it was a negative sentiment.
Nope, not me. It's not getting better on my behalf. I'm not using it. I think this is a terrible idea. Right now, it feels like the wild, wild west.
Yeah, so I'm David Knapp. I'm the director of the Metropolitan Educational Research Consortium, or MERC. We're at Virginia Commonwealth University. We're one of the oldest research practice partnerships in the country, and we're housed in the VCU School of Education. We partner with 5 local school divisions in metropolitan Richmond area that are across urban, rural, and suburban contexts. It's around 160,000 students, 200 schools that are represented in that consortium. Research practice partnerships, or RPPs, like Merck, are growing in popularity across the country, but we're one of the original ones, us and the University of Chicago. I was a high school counselor before I became a researcher. Dave and I kind of share that background where we were both working in secondary schools. He was a teacher. I was a high school counselor, and that definitely has informed my research interests and really my accountability system. So anytime I do any kind of research, I imagine if I was going to present this to my old faculty, would they believe it? Would they roll their eyes? Just to make sure that things are vetted through folks who are actually doing work in the K-12 environment. And my research interest personally, well, first, it's whatever our school division partners want. So I often say that I don't have a research profile. It's whatever they say. And we just sort of design and execute research studies accordingly to be able to address those needs. And what's really interesting is whatever the topic is, you suddenly develop some interest and expertise in it. So I have no expertise or background in literacy, but Virginia school divisions are trying to figure out what to do around literacy because of the Virginia Literacy Act. So we have a study on that. So I'm learning a lot about literacy, and it's really interesting. So now I have a research interest in literacy, but I am really interested in research practice partnerships and some of those processes, just like how are they facilitated? How are they sustained? How do you broker relationships in a way to be able to conduct meaningful research, and then research dissemination and use. So if you have diverse dissemination methods, like we have a podcast, we have seminars, we have data dashboards, an annual stakeholder summit. So if you have a variety of ways that people can engage with research, how does that then promote higher research using K-12 environments, which is always a challenge. So a variety of different interests. And I have some personal interest in supporting mental health in schools because of my counseling background. And there's a lot of research need around that right now.
And I'm David Marshall. I am an associate professor of educational research and evaluation in the College of Education at Auburn University. I also am a co-founder and senior research affiliate of the Plains Research Consortium, which I guess we are in our second year or so. Which is similar to what they do at Merck. I will also vouch Merck does excellent work, where Dave leads. And our idea is similar to make sure that we're doing policy relevant work that can help inform the state of Alabama and beyond. In terms of my research interests, a lot of it, as Dave alluded to, I'm a former middle and high school social studies teacher. And I would say that too informs a lot of what I do, if not maybe all of what I do in some way, shape, or form. And a lot of my interests revolve around topics ranging from charter schools and school choice to just contemporary K-12 education policy. I like to say I want to make sure that what I'm doing is always relevant in the eyes and the minds of the people who are working hard day in and day out in our schools.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the paper you wrote and why you became interested in AI and its potential impact on research.
Well, I'll talk about the genesis of this. I might have, at least initially, been an unlikely person to be writing such a paper. When ChatGPT was originally released to the public in November of 2022, my original reaction was, okay, so hold on. So this gets better because I help it. That, me using it makes it better. Nope, not me. It's not getting better on my behalf. I'm not using it. I think this is a terrible idea. I saw all the worst case scenarios in my mind of where this might lead. And I basically made a decision for 5 months. It didn't exist and I wasn't going to use it. I knew it did exist, but it was not going to get my help. And then one day, and I actually remember the exact date only because it happens to coincide with my brother's birthday. So in March of 28th of 2023, so this is about 5 months later, I do both quantitative and qualitative research, and I was getting ready to analyze some data using Atlas TI, which is a software that the qualitative researchers can use to help, find trends in data and analyze textual data. And all of a sudden that day I opened up Atlas TI and there was AI coding beta. There was starting to be AI based features embedded in software. And I almost, maybe more than anything in my life, on a dime, flipped my mind because again, as I've started, I am a professor. I teach educational research methods. I work with students, not only in my own research endeavors, but for my teaching responsibilities, it's my responsibility to make sure that students are trained up in ways to competently conduct research. And if these tools exist, then students and anyone else, they're going to use them. And I immediately recognized that I couldn't just put my head in the sand anymore. It was incumbent upon me to try to wrestle with this and reckon with, okay, well, these tools are here. What can they do? How can I make sense of them? What do I think about this? But my first sort of instinct was, well, I want to survey and see what other qualitative researchers think about this. I had a hunch of what they might think or might not think about them, but I think that's the hallmark, at least the way I was trained, the hallmark of a good social scientist. If you have a hunch about something, then try to collect some data and see if you're right, or see to what extent the data that you collect, sort of corresponds with what your thoughts were. And so did a survey of qualitative researchers and asked questions around, what they perceived as the ethics, what they would use, what they would consider appropriate for their own use, what they considered the ethics. And I asked them to sort of try on the role of being a reviewer or an editor for a peer review journal. And would this hinder or help in any way, shape, or form their likelihood or propensity to recommend the acceptance of a manuscript in peer reviewed research if they said that they used AI for any of these different stages of the research? And so that's really the genesis of this. It started with me thinking, hell no, I'm not doing any of this, to no, I think we need to wrestle with this. Let's try to see what other people think.
Yeah, well, and I was really glad that David invited me to join the paper. Well, first of all, we should say we used to be in the same PhD program together, so it's just cool to be able to collaborate. And we've been in some classes together and kind of wrestled with some of the same ethical questions around research. And I teach qualitative methods, and I've done qualitative research for a while through my dissertation, through other research projects, into our research practice partnership. And I kind of had a similar initial opinion of AI whenever ChatGPT came out, of being very concerned about it, especially because they needed my phone number. I was like, why do you need my phone number for me to be able to get an account here? And so I was also really hesitant to join, and then finally did. And within qualitative research specifically, I was really concerned about it undermining some of the key elements of that discipline that I thought were kind of critical to actually being able to conduct good, authentic, qualitative research. And the paper, I think the way that David structured the survey does a good job of breaking it down by different elements of what makes up a qualitative study, and thinking about how comfortable do you feel using AI in relation to each of these different elements. And so I think it was transcription and data analysis and reporting and kind of everything in between. Data collection was not part of that paper or part of that survey, which maybe it should be now. But it's just there's things that I've wrestled with, and I also noticed that it was something that was embedded in Atlas, but have real concerns about. I still have concerns about using the AI feature in Atlas because of data privacy, so data security, data privacy, but also the accuracy of what they're finding. Because sentiment analysis and things like that are pretty flawed still. So, just as an example, we sort of did a sample coding of a transcript in my qualitative methods class one time using AI, and because somebody referenced the word winter in their response, it said it was a negative sentiment response. You know what I mean? So it's stuff like that that just requires a lot of kind of oversight, but it also catches a lot of things that you might miss whenever you're doing qualitative research.
Mm. And from my perspective, thanks very much, both of you, for that introduction and overview. I'd be really interested to know what your kind of experience within your own educational settings, your own academic environments, is of how your students and your colleagues are using AI for research, and how are you how are you kind of finding that's developing as AI gets better at doing these things and we get updated versions, and we were just waiting for the new version of Grok, of course, and other kind of applications that students might use as indeed my professional colleagues. What's your experience of how that's rolling out in the US?
Well, I know at least at VCU and within our research center that we're still wrapping our heads around it, and people are very receptive to using it. And me too. Like I feel like every month I'm more and more receptive to using AI. We have AI research groups that get together. They have shared reading related to AI and research. And that includes doctoral students and faculty and staff, anybody that's engaging in research that might end up using AI in some ways. Our common book for all of VCU is The Coming Wave, which is about AI technology. So every incoming freshman allegedly read The Coming Wave whenever they came in. I'm sure they were dutiful about that. But one of the things that we've been doing with this, like with the AI research group and within our research center, we do a lot of sharing case examples of how we're using AI. And that's one of the things that's really helped me kind of come around to like, oh, this is something that I should be embedding into my workflow a little bit more, because there are really impressive ways to be able to incorporate AI that expedite the work that you're doing. My concern has always been about outsourcing my critical and creative thinking. I'm not okay doing that. And I don't want to do surface level or superficial research. And I don't want to, like, I heard it described one time as kind of like the empty calories of research. It kind of feels that way sometimes if you're leaning on it too heavily. But the examples that I've seen have really been helpful for like trying to understand grant applications, like some of the nuance around that, or like what does this state policy say, and what are some of the things that we need to understand related to that. And we will share what we've done and then critique it and offer some calibration and some examples of that. But we always try to treat it as a member of our research team rather than the authority on anything. Like AI is not, I think that's particularly true probably in qualitative methods. You're not necessarily looking for a truth. There's not a capital T truth out there. It's very constructivist in nature. And we try to lean on AI in a way where it's like, you're not going to tell me the answer to this, but you're going to give us an opinion on it, right? And so like, we're going to do our own kind of analysis with this too, and then we're going to triangulate with you and kind of vice versa and have it check our work and things like that. So we wrestle with it. We're always calibrating on it. But we also are just trying to be mindful of the parameters about how you're able to use it, at least within our institution.
And I would say at least within my department, or college, I could probably expand it out that far. There are definitely people who are shunning it and opting not to use it at all. Especially around qualitative research, if I'm honest. Like, we have a couple of faculty who just don't seem to have any interest at all in using these tools. But there's also a lot of folks, especially the individuals within the Plains Research Consortium that I referenced earlier, who are really trying to find ways to productively use it. I know that, for example, this past week in our meeting, we had my department head who's actually pretty sharp with using AI. He uses a combination of Claude and ChatGPT for a lot of his research workflows, and it's pretty impressive the way he's able to simultaneously document everything he does, keep a log of every decision made, and automate a lot of these processes in ways that you previously just wouldn't have done in research. It would have been best practice to have all this documentation, but if you spent the amount of time it would have taken to do this manually, you either wouldn't have done it or you would have never completed a single project in the span of a year, because that's all you would have been doing. So I think there's some impressive ways you can use it. I mean, I think one of the things, if I imagine where we're going to go with this conversation, is that it's the trade-offs. There's always trade-offs in any of the decisions that we're making. I think especially with this, but not just with AI. I think anytime you introduce sort of technology of a sort into the qualitative research paradigm in particular, that there's a trade-off. I'll give a non-AI related example to this. I remember I guess this was about 7-ish years ago. I was doing a research project in Philadelphia, where I was visiting this high school that was re-engaging students who had previously dropped out. And I was traveling up there every 2 or 3 months, interviewing the same students. And I was very interested, similar to David's dissertation work, around possible selves. I was interested in how these students talked about themselves because when I first encountered them 2 weeks prior, they were what society would refer to as a dropout. But how they started to speak about themselves and how they started to speak about possibilities and futures shifted over time. It was fascinating. But this was at a time when I was doing all my transcription by hand. All right, I had the pedal, and then I was doing all my transcription by hand for every one of these interviews. Well, that sounds, yeah, I'll be honest. I'll never do that again, probably. Um, but I'll tell you, this is where I'm going with this. There's a trade-off. There's what you lose with that. One of the things that happened by doing that, and I'm sure David will attest to this, is I knew that data inside and out. In fact, I knew it better than the participants. I'll never forget. This one guy went up to who had told me that his girlfriend was a strong source of support for him re-engaging in school and completing his high school diploma. When I went back 2.5 months later, and of course that was one of my follow-up questions. Do you still have the same support network? Do you still have the same individuals in your corner? I referenced his girlfriend, and he was like, "Hold on, what girlfriend?" And it turns out they'd broken up like a week later, and but I remembered a girlfriend he had that he didn't remember, or maybe I don't know, maybe she didn't exist, who knows? But either way, this was this I knew the data better than my participants knew it, and I think I did because I was manually doing this. That was something I was doing. Now, if you fast forward to today. Um, Not that I wouldn't review previous transcripts ahead of if I was doing a longitudinal qualitative study ahead of doing a next interview, but I'm probably going to have some service do the transcription for me. I'm not going to be as deep into the data personally. And, maybe that's a detail I miss moving forward. So I just want to say, I think this is about not just an AI conversation. I think it's anytime we introduce something that automates part of this, there is a trade-off, and I think there is something gained, and I also think there's something lost. So,
Can we get into the different areas of research where AI might assist or is being brought in? So if you think about the whole process of writing a research paper, what are the spaces and places? So you mentioned a few different places. I wonder if we can just go through them one by one and think, okay, well, that's an area where people are using AI. That's not a place yet, or that's not appropriate, or it's not happening, or whatever that might be.
So qualitative methods, and Dave and I both teach qualitative methods. So Dave, please feel free to fill in anything that I'm missing, but it's really focused on collecting rich data typically through interviews and focus groups. Sometimes it's through short answer responses on surveys. You could do some document analysis there as well, but it's in short, it's working with words instead of numbers. And qualitative research paper in a lot of ways looks pretty different than a quantitative research paper. And some of the areas of that kind of stand out is in a background section, where you're establishing precedent for the work that you're doing for the paper. A lot of times a qualitative research paper would include a positionality statement that basically shows how are you as the researcher connected to the research, because the researcher is the primary data collection instrument and analysis instrument that's happening in a qualitative study. So it's really important to understand how you're connected to it, because that also, and I always advocate this needs to be an intro before your literature review, because that helps us understand how you engage with the literature. It helps us understand how you came up with the questions that you did. All of the decisions that you made are based off of your connection to the research topic. So having that positionality statement really should be included in a qualitative paper. I would argue it should be included in a research paper because we're all connected to our research in some way. So it's identifying potential sources of bias, for example. And then whenever you get through, you have for your methods, it typically will include, sometimes it'll include even a research relationship section just to show did you have any kind of connections with your participants beforehand? And if not, how did you establish that kind of rapport to be able to collect that rich data? Because interviewing especially is this really active process where you're just not cracking somebody open and getting the data out of them. It's a good interview protocol, kind of like the questions you've set up for this podcast. It's interactive, it's semi-structured. And so you're going back and forth and trying to kind of generate that conversation. So the relationship that you have with your participants is going to be really important in that sense. So you may have some sort of description about how that happened. The sampling is always going to it should be purposeful instead of random sampling. In fact, I remember, Dave, I don't know if you've ever had this, but I've had IRB pushback on qualitative submissions that I've put in before. And they said, why aren't you using random sampling? I'm like, because it's qualitative. It's not appropriate to use random sampling. You need to specifically say, I need to understand with the experience of students who previously dropped out from high school in Philadelphia, for example, right? We're not going to random sample all public school students in Philly for that kind of
In hopes I
study.
find someone who might be able to speak to those experiences. Yeah,
Exactly. It's a
ridiculous.
waste of resources, right? Which, like, think about the parallels with AI there. If AI is pulling from everything, so like it's possible that there's more noise that's being incorporated, whereas qualitative, you're really trying to zero in on something really specific. So the purposeful sampling element is really important to it. And then the data collection, again, it's most likely through interviews and focus groups. And then the data analysis, you're talking about thematic coding, which is probably especially now mostly where AI is going to come into the process, where it's really focused on like how did you actually go through the data, because you go through data. I don't know what's your experience with your the study that you're talking about in Philly or some of the other qualitative work that you've done, but at least for my dissertation, it was 17 hours of audio, so it's hundreds of hours or hundreds of pages of data that you're going through. And I always tell my students this in qualitative methods too, like you're about to get more data than you know what to do with. Even for a small semester pilot study, you have all this data. So really, how do you try to organize it? And it's typically through a coding process. It's thematic, where you like establish categories and then codes, and then you would manually assign it, usually in something called Atlas, like the Atlas system or another qualitative coding software. Although I've had some dissertation students that have literally done note cards, like written things down on note cards and organized them on their floor. So however you need to make sense of the data is the way you need to make sense of the data. But think about that from an AI standpoint. If we got to the point where you had used AI to conduct your literature review, so you don't really know very intimately what the literature is, right? Like if the AI did the literature review for you, and theoretically, and we didn't cover this in the paper, Dave, but like the data collection piece, right? Like there's some survey platforms right now, they're saying, do you want us to generate sample data, like pretend data, basically, through AI of how somebody might respond to this based off of what we're able to scrub or the internet? Imagine you use an AI system to be able to collect that data through chat bots or whatever it is, and to do all of the analysis, right? So like, and potentially even write your findings. So there's all these different things where we could just have AI systems doing everything, and then that becomes a published paper that an AI system then reads, and it's this cyclical process of just the robots talking to each other. So like, especially in qualitative, the whole idea is that you've sat with your data, that you remember the ex-girlfriends that your participants talked about, so that you can follow up with that later on, and you establish these kinds of relationships, and it adds all this trustworthiness and richness to the data. Like qualitative methods or qualitative papers have a trustworthiness section. It's kind of akin to validity. And like, if you're trying to understand how trustworthy the findings are, it's really like, what are all the steps that you took to make sure that to kind of try to disprove yourself along the way, right? And if you're not connected with the work in some way, in some intimate way, it possibly undermines your ability to establish trustworthiness in the findings. But I'm sure I missed some stuff, Dave.
No, I mean, I think he did a reasonably good job of going through all of that. I think, among some of the concerns that we may have with some of these the introduction of AI. Yeah, I'd love to get some of the benefits too, because I see some actually huge, a huge upside potentially. But Dave's right. Like if you have AI, can kind of do sort of rough literature reviews. At this point, if it kind of goes through and finds all of your literature, then that's a trade-off there where you're not as deeply informed, and if every stage of the process. I mean, yeah, you could be that much further removed, whereas you're supposed to be pretty. The idea, at least the way pre AI, when we were trained in this, is that this was supposed to be something that you got pretty in depth with, personally. Yeah, personally sort of got acquainted with the data and with the entire project. I think one of the things that is a concern, and this isn't the one. I think sometimes we talk about AI, and it's like this one thing, and like it always looks like this, and obviously it can show up in a lot of ways. You could be, when you say AI, you could be talking about using a non-enterprise large language model. You could be talking about using a large language model for which your university has an enterprise license, which means it's not training on the data, which is an entirely different thing for a data security thing. I know that. My university has an enterprise license for Copilot. And so we can use Copilot for things where we know pretty confidently it's not going to train on the data. Same thing with my Atlas TI subscription. with the conversational AI tool, we've been told that it is not training, or at least our license is set up so it is not training on that data. Um,
You've been told.
I've been told, yes. So you don't. Um, but I mean, I think if you're just dumping data into a large language model, unprotected, then that's a different story.
Right.
In terms of, data privacy, data protection. I actually I think this is an area, I'll be honest, where I can definitively say I'm not sure to what extent that's a risk, and it might be a very big risk, and it might not be that big of a risk. And I think I'll be honest, I don't have the understanding. I have talked to a couple of people who work at Google, and I've kind of questioned them about this. Like, so if you hypothetically put this in, could that be retrieved? And the answer I've kind of gotten is that's not how it's designed. Like this, I think a lot of us have in our minds like sort of a Microsoft like folders like sort of set up. Well, if you put this here, then you can always go back and find that David Naff conversation from June 26th or January 26th, and I can pull out that nugget. And instead, it seems like it's more like a soup where everything gets sort of mixed in, to a larger batch. And like the idea that you would go find that fragment of a sentence that David Naff said on January 26th is not really what it's designed to do. But I do think again, I have the most surface level understanding here, and it's something I think I have more questions than answers. Um, but I do think we need to be cognizant of data privacy and data security, especially as it relates to students, especially as it relates to participants. We have to think about things like our informed consent forms, which is generally we have participants sign anytime we conduct research, saying that they actively consent to being a participant in the research. Did we include in that informed consent that we were going to use generative AI in any stage of the process? And I think if I were, most people's informed consents probably don't necessarily have provisions around that now. Maybe we should. So I think these are conversations that need to happen with regards to, and this is kind of, we were talking before we got started. I think this is where we need to really develop what the guardrails are, sort of the bright red line guardrails. You need to make sure you're doing X, Y, and Z. You probably really shouldn't do A, B, or C. I think we need to do a better job of sort of actively developing that, because right now it feels like the wild, wild west. And I know at least with a lot of my students, they, some of them I think are just sort of, throwing caution to the wind, and they're doing what they're doing. And I guess maybe they're hoping we don't figure out what they're doing in terms of AI. And some of them I know are being extremely cautious because they want to be able to use the affordances of technologies that are emerging, but they also want to make sure they're in bounds. And I don't know if we've always given them the best guidance of what definitively is and what definitively isn't.
I mean, yeah, lots of really interesting points there. I mean, can we dig down a little bit into those trade-offs that we've spoken about? And I think that there are a few areas in which institutionally I'm always monitoring what my own university is doing in terms of monitoring those guardrails. And for me, I think there are three areas that pop up. One is the sort of the neuroscience. So we've all talked about literature reviews and how AI synthesizing information, just seems like, I was speaking to some colleagues in the university a couple of weeks ago, allowing students to do PhD level literature research in conjunction with AI is shortening the process from, a year and a half to 3 months, 3 months, which is great. Shortly, I'm sure it'll be possible that AI can do the whole thing. Well, but the trade-off there for me is huge potentially, which is that we are then degrading all of that neural architecture that supports those skills in the first place. Like David Marshall was saying, that kind of like that laborious writing down process came with a lot of benefits. And one of the things I think that we're finding difficult to do is to measure the nature of that trade-off. And institutionally, to have research groups that are saying, okay, these new tools look amazing. They're saving a lot of laborious time that would be really good to cut out of the process. But let's just look at what we lose if we cut that out of the process. That would be my first kind of issue. And certainly within the UK, and Robert knows my stance on this, I find that universities are being a little bit irresponsible in not looking at the whole range of issues conjured up by the use of these tools. The second one would be around, the fact that we're looking at this now. What are we, like 3-4 years into the rollout of these programs? But we know that there's an exponential increase in their capabilities. And whenever you do a little bit of research on this, you're already a couple of years behind, right? So we know we've got Grok 5 about to come out. It probably will be able to do literature reviews, certainly up to postgraduate level, pretty well. So my other concern is if we drop these technologies into the kind of human behaviors that we know exist within education, we need academics and educators around that to guide not only ethical use of the materials, but also to point out to students that what those trade-offs are for you individually. Looking at our age group, I mean, we're all different ages, but we learn in that by the old roots, right? So we already developed those skills. Now we're using AI sometimes to kind of tweak or enhance what we do. But if you're coming into education, you're 18, you're 21 now, you've only known the way in which AI can assist in those tools. That's one of the things that concerns me and that I meet in my own students that worries me. So I'd be interested to know your feelings on those couple of things.
Well, I'll speak to the literature reviews. I mean, you're correct. Yes. I mean, you can use, I mean, I think it's also how are you using AI? Are you using it to identify sources that you're still then going through and reading and doing your own sort of take on? Are you automating all of it, most of it? I mean, I think there's a range of how you're using AI to do your literature reviews. If you're using it to help you identify sources that maybe you've missed, and you're still going through and doing a lot of the cognitive work yourself, I don't see a problem with that at all. Maybe that's even a strength, that you're getting a more robust, more complete review, and you're not missing sources that you might have otherwise missed. That's not a terrible thing. I do think that, again, one of the trade-offs is if you're automating this to a greater extent. I'm thinking in my own research, I'm thinking back to my dissertation. I had a variable that I ended up including in my regression models that I wasn't going to include initially, but it wasn't until it popped up in 2 or 3 articles that I was reading. I was doing my dissertation was on predictors of high school graduation and dropout, and there was a variable around a course taking behavior and pattern that students who were taking courses in this sequence were less likely, and so I ended up including an entire variable that I hadn't initially anticipated. That I'll be honest, and that wasn't like a big standout finding in any of these papers. It was something that you had to kind of go through. If I was automating this, it's a detail like that I could have easily missed. So I think I would encourage students. One of the things, and we're in a very unique time because as instructors, we're really having to draw on intrinsic motivation as much as we ever have before. I've told students that sometimes, for example, a large language model is helpful in summarizing an article or summarizing a book chapter. And it's not blind to me that some student of mine at some point in time is probably in a pinch before class, put a chapter or an article in a large language model. I have 15 minutes before Dr. Marshall's class. Tell me what this means, so they didn't come in blind. But then I remind my students that the author wrote the other words on purpose, and that they had, there was an intent, for the whole 21-page article beyond just a summary. And there's something lost if you're not doing that. And that, especially, a lot of my doctoral students are maybe still of the age where they came about after AI, so I try to say, look, you develop a skill of scholarly reading. You'll lose that if you just start automating that process. The atrophy is real. So, I mean, I think that's one of the things I would say with regards to literature reviews.
Yeah. I think literature reviews make a lot of sense to kind of focus in on with this question. So I think with the AI use in research, it's about data protection and security and some of the ethics around that. And I think literature reviews is one of the main things that I've wrestled with. And just as an example of this, we were doing a research brief focused on like the use of block scheduling, so 4x4 schedules and how that relates to different outcomes for students for chronic absenteeism, achievement, dropout, graduation, post-secondary enrollment, that sort of thing. And we try to stay with current literature, especially post-COVID, because kind of what happened before COVID, like the playbook has kind of been rewritten in a lot of ways. And our literature review team was really having a hard time finding clear empirical research that showed connections between the use of block schedules and these different outcomes for students, especially academic and behavioral, like attendance. And so I went into ChatGPT and asked, is there anything we're having trouble finding this? What kind of articles have been published in the last 5 years that show clear empirical connections between the use of block scheduling and these different outcomes? And it generated 5 articles that looked perfect, but they're all made up. Every one of them was entirely hallucinated. And so, and I followed up on each one of them. The journals were real. The authors were typically real. They were typically real researchers, but all of them were hallucinated, and they were confidently hallucinated. And there had been previous incidents of this where we were summarizing Virginia state policy related to mental health support in K-12 school environments. And it gave me a lot of different state codes for Virginia. And every one of them I followed up on, and none of them had anything to do with mental health. So it just made up that process too. So the literature review piece is also critical analysis of the literature, right? So like what David was saying about, kind of understanding scholarly writing and trying to do some critical analysis of that, but also recognizing that when something's either low quality or not accurate, or fabricated entirely. And because I work in the K-12 space, I know that David does too. I've seen examples of school board presentations in the minutes where school divisions are making decisions about a program that could be very expensive based on one study that they found from 2009, right? And then they're citing that as the impetus for being able to make a decision about allocating resources and things that are going to impact hundreds of students potentially. And imagine if something like that came from an AI system that was fabricated, right? Like what the implications of that would be. That being said, I'm now at a place where I struggle to imagine doing a literature review without using AI in some ways, because we've done subsequent projects with that. I've gotten better at prompting. I'm less of a Luddite about this stuff now. And so now that I kind of know what I'm doing a little bit more, if I can control the inputs and say, here's 40 articles that we found that seem to be related to supporting students in transition to kindergarten, for example. Which of these are really attending to the academic outcomes? What do I need to know in terms of like, what are the connections here? What are the suggestions? And then organize it in a table for me to make this really make sense. And doing that, and then being able to organize a lot of literature and draw some signal from it and triangulating what our team is already doing, because we were trying to make sense of a lot of literature on that topic. And so in that sense, it was, really important to be able to actually use it. So there are those kinds of trade-offs, I think, but I keep coming back to literature reviews as like, what do you stand to lose by not actively reading it and engaging with it? But some of the ways that I'm leveraging AI now is improving the use, how I'm engaging with the literature, because it's catching things that I would have missed, and it's facilitating my learning while also expediting my ability to actually get through the literature. Like it's found entire special issues on topics that I previously said nothing had been published on, right? And so those are some of the benefits that I think are worth leveraging. But Adam, when you're talking about doc students not having to spend a year on a literature review, being able to spend 3 months on it instead, I definitely see some of the benefits of that, but I also wonder about their own learning. Like if you aren't spending that amount of time intimately engaged with the literature and really trying to attend to or honor the work that people have done perhaps decades before you, are you potentially missing something in terms of a foundation for the work you're going to be doing moving forward? So I know it's a good question.
Mm. And do students and professors in your institutions, guys, do they have training on how to use AI tools? Is there institutional policy like you can use it for this, but you can't use it for this? Because again, my experience here is that everyone's kind of scrabbling around to try and formulate those, but they're really lagging behind where we are and what the student's actual behavior is in the classroom.
Yeah. Well, I know at VCU, at least, you can't put category 1 or 2 data into a large language model. So anything that's confidential or sensitive. So if I collect regional survey data through our partnership, which we do all the time, that can't go into an AI model. Now, it might be different if it's an enterprise account. I'm not totally sure, like what you were saying, David, but at least the VCU policy that's explicitly written right now about how to leverage large language models in research says no category 1 or 2 data in there. Category 3 data, go crazy. So like publicly available data, which we also leverage all the time from Virginia Department of Education, State Council of Higher Education for Virginia, those sorts of sources, put it in there because anybody can access that. Or like being able to do policy analysis, it can really unlock some pretty amazing things because that's category 3 data. It's just something that already exists out there. But in terms of the guidance that you get, there's training that VCU provides. So I feel like I get an email every other day for a new Zoom seminar that they're putting together through our Office of Research and Faculty Development related to AI, which is great. It's been a messy process, I would say, at least at the classroom level, because faculty, in a lot of ways, are expected to kind of set their own AI policy in their syllabi. And there's understandably going to be some variability about that. And what would be really worthwhile as a task would be to maybe scan some of the syllabi and do some analysis about how people are offering guidance for students about using AI. I know for my syllabus, I always say we have to follow VCU policy about any kind of data that's sensitive or confidential shouldn't go into a large language model, and just be thoughtful about like I'm not if you're generating any kind of narrative or text through an AI system, it should not be in your paper. Right? It might be helpful for ideating, but anything that's been generated through an AI system should not be put into a paper. And I know we're nodding about this, and this is something that was in the paper that David and I co-authored. But I mean, you see that more and more. And I've I've taught some undergrad classes and had online discussions that suddenly the quality of the online discussions went up considerably, and they were also very uniform. Where it was like all of a sudden it's this 2 paragraph format where it was like I'm pretty sure I'm reading a robot's response to this discussion question right now. So, you regulate it to the extent that you can or offer those kinds of guidelines, but I don't know. I think we also maybe need some kind of state policy on this. We're focusing on this as our next research project, actually, about how AI shows up in K-12 curriculum, its impact on what we call the 5 Cs, like critical thinking, creative thinking, communication, collaboration, and citizenship, and then how it shows up in policy, education policy at the federal, state, and school division level, at least across Virginia. So how does it show up in school board policies and strategic plans? Because we need to have those kinds of guardrails to be able to use this effectively, I think.
The interesting thing, so for my class, I teach the doctoral level program evaluation class. And if you go back a couple years ago, I had a statement in my syllabus where I, explicitly banned it. It said unless the instructor gave approval. I never gave approval, so that was just my way of banning it. And then last year, I kind of said, well, no, I want you can use it. Because I realized, A, I don't know that I can actually effectively police this. So if I can't effectively police it, so I'm just going to say you can use it, but you have to have an accompanying AI statement. And the AI statement could be, I did not use generative AI for this assignment. I won't grade it if you don't have that. And if you did, great. Just tell me that you use, ChatGPT, Gemini, Grok, Claude. Which platform? What was your prompt? What were your aims, and did it achieve it? Because I wanted to, as much as anything, say, well, let's collectively learn as a class of where it's not working as well as where it is working, and maybe we can move the ball forward together. And what I found last year, that's all I did. I said you just have to have a statement. I didn't give any instruction or any sort of guidance as to what that meant. And what I found is about half my students included a statement, and half my students said that they didn't use it at all. What I later found from a couple of trusted students after the fact, months after the class had ended, was that half of the class didn't trust me, and they thought I was sort of baiting a trap for them, and I was going to just pounce and turn them in the second that they said that they had actually used it, despite several times me saying that's not what I'm doing. That's where a lot of students were. So this past fall, I think I intentionally, no fewer than 10 times in the first 2 weeks, said, I am not setting a trap. I am not setting a trap. This is not to catch you. I would generally just think that this transparency is important. Well, 100% of my students all of a sudden were claimed that they were using AI, which tells me that probably 100% were using it the year before too. And, but now I guess I've made them comfortable enough to share. Now I had the same provisions that Dave did. We have to follow Auburn University policy regarding what you can and cannot upload. But what I found is that the nature of I think this is where it become upon us as instructors. The nature of my assignments are not such that you can you couldn't GPT your way through my course. I mean, they were working on individualized evaluation projects where they had to actually interface with people at the program that they were evaluating, and it's unlikely that ChatGPT or any LLM could have helped them do the entire thing. But maybe it could have helped them create a figure for a slide, or maybe it could have helped them organize, some of their thoughts and things of that nature. Um, but the other thing I changed this year is I actually included several segments of my course where I gave we had explicit conversations around what does it mean we just talked one day about literature reviews. What are the ethics around this? Okay, let's talk about prompt engineering. Like, what's an actual effective way to prompt engineer to get what you want to get out of a large language model? And we spent at least 3 or 4 different classes where, there was a segment of the class where I was giving sort of more explicit instruction around how to use AI in evaluation work. And what I found is the quality of the AI statements actually went up quite a bit. It was less surface level. I was just doing this. Um, so I think all of that is a long-winded way of me saying I think that we do need to have instruction, that's more than just sort of haphazard. Like I said, like Dave said, the same policies at Auburn, where it's kind of every instructor for themselves and sort of setting policy. I think if there was more, if there were courses or there was more sort of training that students had, um, all around the use of AI, and if there was at least some standardized guardrails around what to include, what not to do, what to do, I think that would benefit everyone, because I think the students are certainly hungry for that.
I, I just want to pick up on a couple of things. Your paper, but when I read it, it seemed like the key takeaway was that people were comfortable with the AI doing transcriptions of interviews.
Mm-hmm.
But on the whole, this was a couple of years ago when you wrote your paper, most other things there was a lot of concern about. It feels to me like we might be in a slightly different place a couple of years on.
Yes.
And
Time to
more
replicate,
people
yeah.
are.
Yes.
Yeah, it would be really interesting to replicate it actually, but my sense is people are more open now to using AI. I just wonder, because we've talked a little bit about how we're able to truncate some of the processes, do them quicker, possibly find new things which we would have missed. I wonder where this is going to take us in terms of doing qualitative research.
Well, just a quick note about the transcription piece, because I remember that being kind of low hanging fruit in the study that Dave and I did about, like, yeah, it makes sense that you would be comfortable using that for transcription. Um, but it goes back to, like, how are you considering your participants? Do they know that their voice is getting fed into a large language model? And just as an example of this, whenever I was teaching my qualitative methods class about different transcription softwares that you can use to help expedite the process, I typically show O-Transcribe, where you're doing it manually, but in an online system where it slows it down. You can do timestamps. It's a pretty cool process. It's kind of rudimentary, but it's still pretty cool. It's not a foot pedal like David was describing earlier. We've had those in the past too. And then you could do Otter, where you just upload it into there and it machine transcribes it and organizes by speaker. And then you need to basically go back and check for errors, and there's fewer and fewer errors now. But when I tried to demonstrate it, Otter was blocked by VCU because it was something where Otter was basically mining this data. It's Otter.ai, right? And so it was something where typically whenever I would show that to the class, it's very clearly like, oh, this is obviously the system you should probably use for this, just as long as you're reviewing the transcript on the back end to make sure that it's accurate and you're still getting intimately familiar with the data. And then it was blocked. And so even if it's something where we feel comfortable with it, there's still those parameters of, can you actually feed that kind of transcript data into there? So that's a big piece of this as well. And I think in terms of the training piece with this, going back to actually my qualitative methods class, I'm working with PhD students who are learning qualitative methods. A couple of years ago, when we were working in Atlas and this new kind of beta system for their AI analysis had been introduced, one of the reading assignments is we need to actually go through and read the terms and conditions related to this to understand what are they doing with the data, how is it being used, and what are some of the, like, limitations of this. So, like, not just clicking I agree, but actually we're going to go through and read this and really try to understand it. And so we did that, talked about it as a class, and then we test drove it with some pilot data and found all kinds of issues with it. And ultimately we decided that we didn't feel comfortable using this for a variety of reasons, ethically and because of the accuracy of it. We decided that we weren't going to use it. Even though Atlas in their kind of demonstration videos, they make it really clear that it's like you have the final say on your data. That's the way that they describe it, which I think in a lot of ways is true if you are willing to have the final say on your data. Um, we had made that decision. This was a couple of years ago. Now I don't know if we're allowed to make that decision. Right? So like in terms of the future of the field of qualitative research and the kind of the rigor and try to like if the concern is about not exercising all of the capacity that you have as a researcher, you could argue that both ways with AI and qualitative research. I think you could say if you lean on it too heavily, you're not leveraging your critical thinking, creative thinking, whatever it is to be able to interact with this data. But I think that pendulum is shifting now where if you just decide I'm not going to use this at all and be more analog in the way that I analyze the data, that's not appropriate either. And if I'm going to do that as a instructor and training future education researchers, I'm doing them a disservice to not be intimately familiar with how to use these processes and use them ethically and effectively. So it's something where I feel like I'm still constantly wrestling with it and kind of testing my own comfort levels and I'm never making an executive decision as the instructor for a class with PhD students. It's something we come to together whenever we're deciding how to analyze data for a group research project, just as an example.
So I have to give credit for the analogy I'm about to give to Dr. Asim Ali, who's the head of our teaching and learning center here, the Big Give Center at Auburn. And what he told me, and one of the things that sold me on being a little more bullish on AI a while back, is that he said, look, the last time we had sort of an innovative turning or a technological turning was when we had these guys. We had smartphones, and you almost can't disentangle social media from the smartphones and the screens because they kind of, there's like a feedback loop between the two. Having this allows you to do that more. They both kind of came around the same time. He said, but we didn't teach people how to use these tools. And we just left people up to their own devices to kind of figure out, ways. And, there's the wonderful things that came from that. And there's also some disastrous things that came from that. And if you look at the Centers for Disease Control, was it Youth Risky Behavior Survey that came out? I mean, youth and adolescent mental health declined for about a decade, following the ubiquitous use of smartphones. So there's a lot of things, if you draw the parallel is what if we did something different here? Because I think left to people's own devices, our students are going to use generative AI, and that's where, I think what Dave said at the end there is so important. I think it's incumbent upon us to make sure that we are teaching them productive ways to use it, but also ethical ways to use it, healthy ways to use it, ways that sustain their own ability to still learn. Because that's where, my concern is in the long run that, people aren't going to develop critical thinking skills. People aren't going to develop their own ability to critically read and critically think through things, because if their muscle memory is always to lean on, well, what is AI going to do? That said, I think there's a lot of possibility. One, I think that you could use AI as a robustness check. So for example, if you had an enterprise license or something that didn't train on data, say me and Dave do a qualitative research project, we go through and we code and we analyze. I think I could see a future where if you don't upload that into, some sort of secure, large language model to say, hey, did we miss anything as a robustness check? Maybe perhaps where in the same way that you might upload syntax as part of your data transparency for a quantitative project, this might be something you upload as part of your qualitative, workflow. I see that as being something that might become commonplace. I also think that with qualitative research, a lot of times we deal with small sample sizes, and if we're very honest, we're dealing with small sample sizes most of the time out of bandwidth. I know we'll say, oh, we hit saturation. Okay. Which for those who are not familiar, saturation.
Running out of time.
You're starting to hear the same things over and over and over, and you don't need to interview more people. In truth, I think a lot of times it's about bandwidth. All right, did you interview 12 people and not 20? Because, well, there's an X amount of time that goes into scheduling every interview, into conducting every interview, getting the transcript back. And even if you have a service do it for you, you're going through that transcript, you're cleaning it up, you're taking notes, you're probably doing a first pass of coding, you're probably at least doing a second pass of coding, and you're doing this for each. I mean, so that's time that's just sort of compounds. What if, for example, And I will say, I did have the weird experience of being interviewed by a chatbot. There was a survey. I ask people to take surveys of mine all the time, so I try to reciprocate. So there was a request to do a survey from some researchers, and I did it, and it ended up being more of a chatbot interview than a survey. And I have to say, this was a year ago or so. And I have to say, I even tried to throw it off. I told it some jokes and I tried to and it was pretty good. It was pretty good, which means it's only better now. Well, imagine if we could train a chatbot to interview teachers, and no longer do I have a sample of 15. I have a sample of 1,500. We could say much more robust things about what teachers are thinking and what teachers' experiences are if we had the capability of collecting data from a very large number, similar to a survey sample, a very large number of teachers, and we had the ability to analyze larger amounts of data. I don't know what that workflow would look like. There would obviously have to be human in the loop. We'd have to train on a certain amount of coding and verify a certain amount of coding. I'm just sort of thinking into the future. I know there's trade-offs related to that, but I think one of the trade-offs on the plus side is you could have much larger qualitative data set projects where you can answer questions with larger volumes of data. But I think we have, when and if that capability is here, and maybe it's here or we're close to it already, we're going to need to have some very thoughtful people sit down and think about, okay, well, we have this capability now. That's an upside. What are the downsides? How can we mitigate that? What are the ways that we responsibly can handle that? But I mean, that is an advent that has not previously existed in the history of social science research, to be able to do very large and qualitative data collection and analysis. And so I think that's one of the possibilities that exists.
Yeah. Well, and within that vision, David, like we talk a lot about in qualitative research, the goal isn't generalizability, it's transferability. Like, can you relate to the findings? And anytime I have a student that does a limitation section and says one of the limitations of their qualitative papers that is not generalizable, I always push back. It's like, you wouldn't have done this if you were looking for generalizable research. You wouldn't say with a big secondary data analysis that it's not transferable as a limitation, that you can't relate to the findings. But with what you're sharing, that opens a door. Like, maybe we could produce both generalizable and transferable findings, which would be great. But the challenge there is also, like, how do you purposefully sample 1,500 teachers, like you were saying, right? So like, there's still the intentionality of making sure that your sample is controlled in a way that these are the people that you want to make sure are participating. So even with the human element out of it, you still, from a methodological rigor standpoint, have to consider some of those things. So it's always a trade-off.
For sure.
Could we also zoom out just a little bit as we head towards the end of the chat and think about the space of the university, let's say around 2030? Because obviously the university space is also an environment in which our students are learning relational skills. They're learning, especially the kind of undergraduate students, they're coming together in social environments that they haven't experienced before. Certainly what we're seeing in the kind of UK wide environment, I think, might gather pace. And I'd be interested to know your experience in the US, which is probably less human teachers employed. So we're seeing kind of redundancies across the sector as more and more students rely and have access to AI tools, especially at undergraduate level. There's less requirement for human educators to be involved in that process. And then we have the knock-on effect of students in social spaces finding that their lives are kind of dominated by the technology in various ways, both in the kind of social domain, obviously the smartphone, but also I imagine that AI will gradually creep into that space. What are your feelings about that? And what's your kind of sense of where we're heading in terms of the university as more than just an educational research space, but a social space, a cultural space?
Well, I know on the teaching end, I mean, we have these conversations at VCU. I'm sure this is true for other universities pretty broadly, about like the over reliance on adjuncts for teaching, right? So like, you have more and more students that are learning from adjunct instructors, which ends up being an additional cost burden. Like, the adjunct pay is a joke typically. So like, teaching one adjunct class is fairly cheap, but if you're hiring a number of adjuncts to be able to cover the teaching load of faculty that have course buyouts or whatever it might be, then that ends up potentially being a resource issue. So I can understand the temptation, certainly, if there's something that's a more automated way of being able to deliver instruction to students, then I can understand why things might potentially move in that direction. I obviously feel like there are real trade-offs with that, especially if I'm a student that's paying full tuition, because tuition is not going down at universities. If I'm paying full tuition and I'm just going to be interacting with robots the entire time, I would be pretty pissed off about that as a student at any level. So there's that element of it. At the K-12 level, because I live in that space too, just as an example, I was attending a talk one time from somebody who was working kind of like the federal space and really had an understanding about just like kind of the broad landscape of PK-12 education and some of the issues that we have, but was also talking a lot about AI as a potential benefit there, but also some of the risks of it. And he had said that he had attended a demonstration one time of an AI teacher, essentially, that can teach AP level classes. And the argument was that there are some, and this is a real issue, especially in rural areas, that there's a limited number of AP classes that are available to students, advanced placement classes available to students, especially in AP STEM fields like AP science and math classes are pretty limited, especially in rural spaces. And it's hard to recruit teachers to go and live and stay in some of these smaller rural towns. And so saying that this could be a real boon potentially, like you, from an equity standpoint, these students now have access to an AP level teacher. The challenge was, and this was a couple of years ago, so this is probably less of an issue now, that it was about 10% inaccurate, right? And so what they were teaching, students were getting maybe 90% accuracy. And so it was like, what's the trade-off? You have no calculus AB instruction at all, or you have it at 90% accuracy. And obviously that inaccuracy gap is probably shrinking a little bit. So I could see both sides of that argument. My concern is if that's a model that gets tested and we have a teacher workforce issue and it's hard to retain teachers and that becomes more and more of a challenge, then we're going to replace teachers with AI systems and these AI bots. And I have a kid that's going to start kindergarten next year. He's got 13 years of this that he's getting ready to go through. And I have no idea what the landscape of this is going to be moving forward. We were talking about investing in his college funds, which we're doing, but it's also like, what's college going to be in 18 years, you know? And there's all these kind of internal training programs that companies are using now. So it's hard to know what higher ed's going to look like. It's hard to know what K-12 is going to look like. So I do think that that's going to be integrated more into teaching systems. And my instinct is that it's not for the better until I see some examples of it potentially being for the better kind of at scale.
You know, I mean that's a very, and the thing is when you said 2030, I thought to myself, I was preparing for like 2040, 2060 or something. And I was like, hold on, 2030, that's like 3 years, 4 years from now. Yeah, so that's not even far away. There's a part of me, so I'll give my ideal answer and then I'll give my sort of more realistic answer. The ideal answer in me says that teaching and learning is inherently a human endeavor, and it is. I mean, not to say that people can't learn, for example, from an asynchronous online course, but there's still a human behind on the other side that if they're taking care in the way that I at least think you should be doing asynchronous instruction, you're doing so with instructor social presence in mind. You're trying to inject a human element even into those asynchronous spaces. I think but I think inevitably you are going to see people lean on AI probably first a little and then, then more, in some of the teaching elements of, in post-secondary education. My hope is that there's still what it looks like in the end is you still have students having at least the majority of their learning coming from what we might think of as typical standard 2025-26, face-to-face classrooms with a human instructor. And I especially think this is important. I think it's important for undergraduate, for that teaching and learning paradigm, but I think it's increasingly important in graduate education. One of the things I've often said, just when people have been wrestling whether to do something online or face to face, I always tell them, I harken back to, I think about some of the classes Dave and I took together at VCU. And I said, look, here's the thing. Could I have gotten the same material in an online class? Yes, but that wasn't the good stuff. The good stuff was the conversation I had with Dave, who was sitting across from me in our measurement class, before class or on break or afterward, where we said, "Hey, we both have these things in common. We both have some ideas, around K-12 education. Hey, let's pull on some of these threads, after class, or let's think about what's a research project where we could analyze." See, in the future, if you don't have some of those interactions, I'm not going to have that conversation with David Neff, and we're not going to be on the podcast in 2026 together, because we wouldn't have written a paper together about this. And I mean, and I think that again, that goes back to because a lot of this is inherently human endeavors, and so however this shakes out, and Lord knows I don't know what that looks like. But however it shakes out, I'm going to probably be on the side of advocating for trying to keep as much of the human in the loop, trying to keep as much of the human endeavor aspect of teaching and learning as possible.
We have
Because
to
I
come
think,
back in 4 years' time and see if our predictions were kind of in any way, on the money. I think that the real change for me, just to kind of summarize that point, is when the expertise available in something like a large language model is more than I, as an instructor, have, at scale. So the student is like, Adam, can you tell me about this? And I have a level of expertise about that, but they're like, well, I can just ask that question to the bot, and it knows every single piece of music. I'm a music educator. Every single piece of music and every single technique that's ever been used. Whereas you only know, I don't even know what my percentage would be, but it wouldn't be very high, right? Compared to that. So I wonder what will happen then in terms of that kind of balance of, and that notion of expertise and how that will shift to machine learning.
Yeah. But you could serve a role in working through that together. Like, I mean, the future of jobs is knowing how to prompt AI properly. And so maybe that's a big role of what faculty are effectively able to do is like understanding these systems, having some content knowledge, but part of your pedagogy is also effectively prompting and critiquing these AI systems. Yeah.
yeah, and I think that to that point, I think faculty who do two things. I think faculty who learn how to use these tools and invest time and effort into learning how to be productive with AI. But also faculty who are also proactive in changing the way you're teaching, changing the way you're assessing student learning to where it can't just be a writing assignment or a discussion prompt that all of a sudden gets better in these uniform 2 paragraph responses, as Dave was alluding to. Being mindful about the way we're assessing student learning, being mindful about the way we're shifting our classes. If I have one fear of higher education is it used to be kind of a model, and I don't have any specific person in mind. I'll say that out loud, but it used to be kind of a model. If you wanted to, maybe you got to tenure an associate professor and you could kind of coast and keep doing the same thing, or maybe you get the full professor and then you just assign the same readings over and over and you could kind of coast. That model isn't going to work anymore. We have to be continually changing, continually evolving, continually interrogating how we're conducting our classes, how we're assessing student learning. And my biggest fear is I'm not sure a critical mass of us will all take that to heart. When the old model and the old incentive structure historically has always been that you can maybe get away with not interrogating how you're assessing student learning, how you're conducting your classes on an annual basis.